Hello, this is Loon. I decided to make a support guide because I was getting questions from people who wanted to improve. So today I will try to teach you the basics of supporting in Lost Ark as well as some more advanced tips to take it to the next level. As a disclaimer, I only have experience with Bard and Artist. So this guide might not tell you everything you're looking for if you play Paladin, but I hope some of the general advice I give can still help you. There are other guides out there. And the intent is not to throw shade, simply to answer questions that were asked to me directly despite guides already being out there. Some statements are opinionated, and I try to be as transparent as possible. Otherwise I try to be as accurate as possible and be factual. There is a lot of stuff I want to say, so it will be split across multiple guides. One that gives general information about supporting, and then more advanced, class-specific guides. Something that I judge very important if you want to improve on your support is to make use of a DPS meter. I will not tell you how to get it, but you can find one with your own research. It gives you direct feedback for what you are doing and really helps you figure out when you're doing something wrong. It also makes the effort you put in a lot more rewarding. Because the in-game MVP screen only tells you if your team played well, not what you did individually. You may have heard that DPS meter breeds toxicity and this kind of discourse. The truth is, it is only a tool, and you can do whatever you want with it. I would suggest avoiding insulting other players because of something you see on the meter, of course. It is technically against terms of service to use it, so use at your own risk, but you should know people have been using it for 2 years, and not a single person has been banned because of meter. If you are new to support and look at your performance in the DPS meter for the first time, you might be unhappy or feel lost as to how to improve. Just remember that everyone has been there at some point, and that this guide is all about understanding what you might be missing. First, the basics. Supports follow a gear path different from that of other classes. I'll describe the specifics below. Then, supports have 3 to 4 types of stacking damage buffs. A source of healing, varying sources of shields and damage reduction, 1 strong damage reduction, and a debuff management skill. In Tier 3, supports all take the Yearning gear set. It is important to understand that this set provides different buffs for you and for your teammates. Your teammates get 8 to 12% attack speed and movement speed, and 8 to 12% additional damage. You get 16 to 20% more meter generation, 16 to 20% more movement speed, and that is all. Crucially, you do not get increased attack speed, which means unless you have other sources of attack speed than swiftness, you do not reach the attack speed cap at 140%. This is valuable because supports are generally limited by their animation speed rather than by their cooldowns. With more attack speed, you can always be better. The primary stat supports want to invest in is swiftness, because it lets you improve the uptime of various buff skills. Swiftness reduces your cooldowns, increases your attack speed and movement speed. You will see in this guide that in general all sources of cooldown reduction are valued on supports. The secondary stat you should invest in is Specialization. Specialization works in very similar ways for all supports. It scales how much meter you get per skill cast. It also increases how much healing your identity heal skill provides. Finally, it increases how much additional damage your identity damage buff offers to the party. For elixirs, you should aim for the Luminary set, and pants with attack power buff efficiency. For the rest, max HP is nice on the chest piece, and useful secondary lines are Intelligence, Weapon Power, Max MP, and Resource Blessing. In Tier 3, you only need cooldown gems, and so you can live fine with just 8 gems, 1 for each of your skills. Once you reach Tier 4, you will have to add 3 damage gems to that set, 1 for your identity buff, and one for each of your AP buffs. If you read the other gem effects, you might see that some more skills have special effects in Tier 4, but sadly they are not viable because you cannot remove any of your cooldown gems. Some DPS players like to know when your identity buff is up in order to adapt their rotation. To make them happy, you can bind a chat macro to your identity skill. I personally do not look at that when I play DPS, so I don't think it is crucial, but it's just an option. Another useful skill to bind a macro to is your awakening skill, as it tends to have a long animation, and your teammates might waste a potion during your casting animation. I would also advise to bind a macro to your hyper skills so that your team knows when to cast their hyper awakenings, as it's the only buff that affects those. Do not bind macros to your brand or AP buffs. This adds too much clutter and serves no purpose. Those buffs are expected to always be up when it matters. It is fairly common for supports to have mana issues. This means that you get to a point where you cannot cast any skills because you are out of mana. Sadly, in a fight that is long enough, this will always happen. You can mitigate that by making it happen as late as possible, and hope a fight never gets long enough for you to run out. There are two effects to look out for that can increase your sustainability. Mana regeneration increases how fast you gain back the mana you consume, while max mana increases how long you need to empty your mana and also increases how fast your mana regenerates. You can use what we call mana food, usually master herb steaks, that increase your mana regeneration significantly, but you need to use those every single time the raid wipes. Tier 3 bracelets can roll effects that increase your max mana or have a chance to refund mana when you cast a skill. Elixirs can increase your max mana or your mana regeneration. There is an engraving called Max MP Increase which achieves that same goal. Lastly, you can tweak tripods and runes to manage your mana. Focus runes reduce the cost of one skill, while conviction and judgment can be combined to increase your mana regeneration. You should also know that the engraving magic stream increases mana regeneration. However, because of its cooldown reduction, you gain less effective mana than the description would let you imagine. You might not be sure of what your eyes should be paying attention to when playing support for the first time. There is a lot you need to look at and it will take a while to get used to it. You need to look at your skill cooldowns, boss patterns, your team's HP. This is already a lot to keep track of, and you will need to learn to pass all that information. Once you can do it, you can also consider paying more attention to boss HP bars, your buff bar, enrage timers, and sometimes the mini-map, which also give important information for supporting. The most important buff to maintain on support is always your attack power buff, often abbreviated as AP, and buff % in the meter. The basic buff gives 15% of your attack power to your teammates, and then increases the total attack power by 6%. This means assuming you have the same gear as your teammates, you give roughly 21% extra damage to your teammates, and it scales to 25, or even 30% depending on your progression in other systems. For all supports, this buff is available on 2 different skills that you should try to alternate over time. If the buffs overlap, they will not stack. This means that you cannot cast all your skills whenever they come off cooldown, or you will end up with downtime on your buffs. It is theoretically possible to get near 100% uptime on this buff, so ideally you want to get as close to 100% as you possibly can. Once you start to actively think and start being careful to avoid overlapping your AP buffs, you should get roughly 80% uptime, which is a good starting point. It's fine if yours is lower. This guide is all about improving that. The simplest damage buff from supports is your brand. Some people also call it mark, stigma, debuff, or B% in the meter, without any special buffs when it is applied. It increases all damage taken by the target by 10%. In general, the skills that can brand the boss don't require too much management. Just like your AP buff, brand uptime can always be near 100%. You can typically get good mileage by simply casting your branding skills off cooldown, somewhere in the 85% range. Let's talk about your identity buff. You may hear Serenade, Moonfall, Aura, Courage, or Item percent in the meter. Barring special cases, the buff you give your team with your identity is around 10% damage, just slightly weaker than your brand. As such, it is your buff with the lowest cast priority, contrary to what a lot of people might tell you. Just know there are some exceptions to this for now. Unlike your other two damage buffs, you will usually have significant downtime on your identity buffs. You of course still want to maximize it, but depending on the circumstances, it can be perfectly acceptable to be much lower than the other two. For this one, it is difficult to give a good estimate of what your uptime should be, because it depends a lot on your class, your build, the raid you play, and the amount of heals you cast. It can be anywhere from 25% to 85%. Or more, if you are very overgeared and the boss phase is often. The last damage buff is from your Hyper Awakening skill. People usually call it T-skill, Hyper, or Aria. It is only available on characters who entered Tier 4 and completed the Hyper Awakening quest. It gives a 10% damage buff to your party, and a 20% damage buff to their Hyper Awakening, Alt plus V. This is currently the only buff that affects Alt V, so you should try to save that skill for specific windows. Otherwise, it is your lowest priority buff and you can usually get around 30 to 50% uptime on it. The skill is very new, so there is a lot less we know about it. You should be very careful when casting it because it only has paralysis immunity, so you can still get knocked, which will cost a lot considering your long cooldown. I try to save the skill when I don't have a Serenade up. Thankfully, the buff has a large area of effect, so you never have to pay attention to where your teammates are when casting the Hyper. For the current endgame raids, you usually save your Hyper for Thamine G1 35 bars, G2 25 bars, G3 255 bars, Shield and Clashes, G4 Procol, 175 bars, 87 bars, Collision. Echidna G2 Snakes. Behemoth Head Breaks. This is specific to Bard and Artist. If your teammate's HP is low, you have to consume some meter to heal them. This means that you will lose some uptime on your identity buff. In Lost Ark, your role is to be a support, not a healer. So, you must not cast your healing skills without first making sure they serve a purpose. One good rule of thumb to start is to cast a healing skill when you have at least two teammates who are in danger. Whether your teammates are in danger is something that is up to you to gauge. But it can be anywhere between 80% HP if you like to be safe, and 40% if you don't mind risking some deaths to get more damage done. You shouldn't be casting a heal if all your team's HP is already capped, and you also shouldn't be casting a damage buff if all your team's HP is in the red. You should almost never heal yourself. If your HP is low, potions are made for that. Supports have very efficient potions already because of the engraving, expert, as well as the lack of cursed doll. So there is no excuse to save potions. The only situation where you should heal yourself is if your potions are unavailable. Whether it is because of an item lock mechanic, or because you ran out of potions. In those situations, you can heal selfishly because your most important job as a support is to live. If you die, the rest of your party does a lot less damage and is exponentially more likely to also die. As we saw before, healing skills have an opportunity cost, so ideally you want to protect your team before they take too much damage. There are two main ways to achieve that goal. Shield skills give some temporary HP to your party that will soak damage instead of their HP bar. The easiest way to use shields is to stagger their casts so that your party is shielded for as long as possible. With that, they're always safe as long as you have enough uptime. Damage reduction skills make your party lose less HP when they take damage. Supports all have one very potent DR skill that also gives a shield to the targets, making them nearly invincible to normal damage. The most obvious use case is when you have a party member knocked on the floor with no stand-up. You can protect him from any follow-up damage. Of course, they can still die from failing raid mechanics, drowning, or falling off the map. A good support knows when it is necessary to use that strong DR, and when standard shields will suffice. In Lost Ark, your role isn't that of a pure damage buffer. There are many patterns in the game that are good opportunities for DPS players to do damage while ignoring attacks. However, they will often need your strong DR skill to enable that behavior. You can't tell him to just dodge more, so that you only give damage buffs. Because the overall damage of the party will be lower if they always have to wait during those greeting patterns. The last feature of supports is their debuff management. You can see your character's debuffs above your mana bar. Artist and Paladin have a cleanse skill that can remove debuffs. More specifically, it can remove all the stacks of one debuff without a red outline. If you have multiple debuffs, only one of them is picked, but in most modern raids you only get one type of debuff. Cleanse skills are mainly a corrective measure, meaning they do not enable greeding, but they could save your teammates. Bard has a unique debuff management skill, Guardian Tune, which gives your party immunity to a more restricted pool of debuffs known as status ailments. The rules are sometimes inconsistent, but in general the skill protects your team against one instance of a fear, earthquake, stun, imprison, and the like. In counterpart, Guardian Tune does nothing against damage over time debuffs. Blind, slow, etc. Guardian Tune can be an enabler in some cases, because it lets your team seamlessly ignore incapacitating attacks. Once you get more consistent with avoiding your AP buffs overlapping, you should be able to get somewhere around the 90% uptime mark on the AP buff metric, as well as the brand buff. Do note that sometimes, even if you play well, if your party members are not playing in melee range, your uptime will look worse than it should. That 90% AP uptime is taken assuming your team mostly stands inside of your buffs. You might be satisfied with that, and that's okay. Some people like to optimize though. So this is what we'll work on here. Every missing percent is harder to reach than the previous one. The first thing you need to understand is that the DPS meter does not count uptime in the literal sense of time. Instead, it counts how much of your teammates' damage was done with a buff that you provided. This means that your uptimes do not go down when bosses take reduced damage or are immune to damage. However, your uptime can swing significantly in a few seconds if you have a teammate that bursts without being buffed by you. If you want to maximize your uptime on your AP buff as well as your brand, you need to understand when a boss becomes hittable by your teammates, and you need to be at least as greedy as your teammates. If you play with someone who is always squeezing out all the damage they can, then you too need to always be using your two main buffs before they start doing damage. To add on that, you should know that both your AP buffs have a delay between the moment you press the button and the moment when your team is buffed, in the same way. Harp has a setup time and all other branding skills have some sort of travel time. Since brand and AP can theoretically be cycled with no downtime, it's a good practice to cast those buffs slightly before anyone can hit the boss, so that you can squeeze out more uptime. This is especially important in raids with a lot of mechanics like Echidna Gate 2 or Thamine Gate 3 and 4. For your identity buff, the situation is slightly different. Since it will always have downtime, you only want to cast it when you know your party will be hitting the boss for its whole duration, or at least one teammate will, depending on what you care about. In any case, you shouldn't be wasting its uptime by pre-buffing. It's very important to keep track of boss HP lines, team meter, timed mechanics. Optimizing your hyper requires some coordination to make sure your team uses their hyper awakening while your buff is up, and you need to learn case by case how much time each mechanic takes. In general, you really don't want to get knocked on support. Of course, DPS players don't want to get knocked either, but when you play support, you never have an excuse. Because you have so many sources of super armor, strong DR usually, spacebar on a short cooldown, identity buff and identity heal, awakening on a short cooldown, and other tripods very often. When you are on the floor, you can't quickly help someone in danger and you obviously aren't buffing. If you are about to get hit by a pattern that could knock you, you need to learn to use appropriate super armor because you can withstand the damage most of the time. Most patterns can also interrupt your skills that aren't immune to paralysis. You should pay a lot of attention to boss patterns, and this is one of the reasons why. At a certain level, you should never have skills that get interrupted while you are casting. The same argument stands for grabs. However, in recent raids there are some mechanics or patterns where you are helping your team if you get grabbed. In that case, you should ideally try to cast your AP buff and your brand before getting grabbed. Your team will thank you, and if you're lucky, you will be released before your buffs expire. To end this video, I will show you an example of Bard gameplay in the newest Guardian, Argios. I would also like to thank Majory, Kalansis and Mama for helping me learn to play those classes. Stay tuned for the advanced guides in the future.